I'm an attorney here at CAR. I write a lot of the monthly magazine articles. I edit the Q&As, and I give this class. And but what I've mostly done at CAR, what a lot of the attorneys do here, is they talk to agents about their transactions. I've spoken to well over 45,000. I've had well over 45,000 calls, and I'm approaching 50,000 calls. And when I hit 50,000, I think I get a set of steak knives. It's a goal, you know. It's like a prize. Sort of keeps you motivated. But a little bit of house cleaning. First. So the exams for this will be sent out by 5 p.m. the following business day. Now, this is not for continuing education credit. This is for the TC credit, however. And the webinars are being recorded, and they'll be sent to you by 5 p.m. the following business day as well. If you have tech problems, then call the GoToTraining people at 855-352-9002. So again, with tech problems, 855-352-9002. Okay, with that out of the way. So the objectives of this class are, we're going to focus mostly on residential 1 to 4, but not exclusively. And we're going to address common questions and points of confusion. I'm going to try to offer practical tips. Out of all the time and number of calls I've had with agents, I think I have some, I feel like I have some idea of the kinds of problems that come up routinely. And that's sort of the basis of the class, that's sort of the inspiration of the class. So it's combined with legal analysis and practical tips. And then the fourth bullet point here is we're going to try to limit liability. Yes, this is a risk management class. So the idea is that by following the advice and the ideas, that you're going to limit your liability. If you get into trouble, you'll know that you can defend yourself and you'll sleep better at night. Okay. Now, with that being said, just a starter, we're going to go through the history of disclosures very briefly. So the old rule was buyer beware. And, you know, going back to colonial times, merry old England, probably every state in the country, the rule was buyer beware. You bought something, there was no obligation to disclose anything about it. What you got, what you paid for is what you got. And that's changed pretty radically, and today there are just a few states left which are really buyer beware states. For the most part, almost all the states have gone over to what I would call disclosure states. Now in California, this happened in the 1940s, and it first happened through our court system and judges. And that at that time, judges made rulings, consistent rulings, saying that sellers of real property had a duty to disclose material facts affecting value or desirability. And in 1963, there's a big case, the Lynch case, which applied the same standard to agents. So from 1963 going forward, at least at common law, there was a duty to disclose material facts affecting value or desirability of the property from both sellers and agents. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just go through a lot of the most important disclosures and to sort of discuss the important points and give an explanation of what's going on with them. So the first one is a big one, and that's the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships. And this is going to be required on all residential 1 to 4s and leases over and leases over 1 year. And additionally, it's required on, quote, commercial. So commercial basically means everything else with the exception of residential 5+. So this form, this type of disclosure is required on all properties with the exception of residential 5+. Now, failure to deliver this form at time of taking the listing may make the listing unenforceable, and in fact, there's a lot of bad things that could happen if the form is not delivered. So you could lose the listing, you might not get paid, it's a CalBRE violation, and if it was a dual agency, if the buyer and seller were both being represented by the same brokerage, then that would allow the seller to rescind the purchase agreement. So, important form. And you might ask, well, how do we know all of these things? How do you know that all of these bad things could happen? And the answer is, there's a case. So you have the Weisser versus Desmarais case, and in that case you had an agent who was essentially representing the buyer. And they located a property. It was a FSBO seller, and the agent approached the seller, told him the offer. The seller signed the offer, but no agency form was presented. So a couple days later, the seller got cold feet and decided he wanted to get out of this contract. And the result is the Weisser versus Desmarais case. The judge said, yes, you can do that because this agency form was not delivered. The big question that we get with the agency is really how it's delivered, because the delivery process is quite complicated. But I've tried to break it down and make it relatively simple. So as a listing agent, you're going to deliver this form to the seller when you take the listing. And if you're working with the buyer, then you're going to present this form to the buyer no later than when the buyer signs the offer. So you can present it to the buyer earlier, but the very latest you can do it is when the buyer signs the offer. So one to the seller when the seller signs the listing, and one to the buyer at the very latest when the buyer signs the offer. And if it's a dual agency, then you stop. You don't go any further. Okay. And of course this begs the question, well, what exactly is a dual agency? And a dual agency in California is when you're working with the same broker. If both agents work for the same broker, that's a dual agency. So it doesn't matter where the agents are located. They can be in different offices. They might feel that they're not part of a dual agency, but that doesn't matter. What matters is, do they have the same brokerage? Do they have the same broker? Are they working for the same brokerage? And if the answer is yes, that's a dual agency. So with a dual agency, it's one to the seller when the listing is signed and one to the buyer no later than when the buyer signs the offer. If it's not a dual agency, you do the same thing, exactly the same thing, one to the seller when you sign the listing, one to the buyer no later when the buyer signs the offer. But in addition, there's another form, and this could be the most confusing form in all of real estate. The buyer's agent delivers a second agency or a third agency, however you want to term it, with the offer for the seller to sign and return. So it's the third agency. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but I wouldn't worry about that. That's just what the law requires, and so if that's what the law is telling us to do, then that's what we do. Okay, so we do have a chat box, and I'll from time to time I will look at the chat questions that come in. And one person has asked, "Hey, do we get a copy of this this webinar?" And the answer is yes. So it will be available after 5 o'clock the following day, I guess tomorrow. Probably be available earlier, but that's the latest time we promise to send it out. Okay, so one issue that kind of comes up, it's a perennial issue. It's since I've started here, which was nearly 14 years ago, we always get this issue. You're a buyer's agent, you have a strong offer, all cash buyer, no contingencies, you send it in, and you think you're going to get this deal, and then you wait. what happens? Nothing. You don't know what happens. And then a week later, you see that the property is already in escrow. And it dawns on you, hey, was my offer even presented? So we get this question quite a bit here. Well, it seems like quite a bit. People are really upset when they have the question. And we found that this agency form can sometimes, help you out. It can maybe facilitate communication with the seller. And the way it works is the third agency form can be presented directly to the seller if you get no response back from the listing agent, or even if you do, if you don't get that agency from the seller. And this is because of what the law actually says, and I have it quoted there, where the selling agent does not deal on a face-to-face basis with the seller, the selling agent may deliver the disclosure form by certified mail addressed to the seller at his or her last known address. So this law is actually telling you you can deliver this agency form directly to the seller by certified mail if you haven't received it back. Now, I don't know what other information you can provide with the form. You could probably say on a cover letter, yes, I'm an agent, I presented an offer through your listing agent and we're waiting for a response. You probably could say that. I don't think you could discuss anything further about the terms of the offer. But anyway, it's just something to keep in mind in this situation, which does come up from time to time. Now, one of the interesting things about the agency form is that, contrary to popular belief, it doesn't actually tell you who you're representing. It seems odd. Like if you give it to if you're the listing agent giving it to the seller, you would think that it's telling the seller, I represent you, but it's not. It's actually only describing a kind of potentiality. It's saying a possibility. It's describing a possibility. So when you give it to the seller, you're saying, I could be your listing agent, and if I am your listing agent and we have an exclusive or dual agency, these would be my obligations and duties. So it's not actually stating definitively that you're representing one part or the other. Where does that happen? Well, that happens on the confirmation. So the confirmation, which is part of the same law, it's all part of the same law. This confirmation is telling you definitively who is representing who. And you need to get this right. So if it's a dual agency, and then I'm going to use my pointer here. Where's my pointer? Pointer. Okay. Or a pen. So if it's dual agency, you need to make sure that this box is checked. Now you can fill in this space. If it's a dual agency, this space is optional because the broker's name will be written on both the top for listing agent and the selling agent. But if you fill in both, then you definitely need to include this box as well. So check, check. And you can't get that wrong because it's the same problem of not having delivered the agency in the first place. All those bad things that we talked about that can happen if you fail to deliver the agency, they all come back to haunt you. Okay, so how do I get rid of this thing here? There we go. Okay. Okay, so that's the agency. Pretty exciting stuff, I know. Another form which is delivered automatically with the purchase agreement, it's pre-checked, so it can never not be delivered, is the PRBS form. And what I like about the PRBS form is it's in a way self-explanatory. You just read the name of the form and you get it. So possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, disclosure, and consent. There it is. It lays it out right there. Possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. So why is this important? Well, it's basically important because if you're in an office, especially a large office, it might be 50 or 100 or 500 agents, and you don't know if any other agent is making offers on the same property that you're making an offer on. So there could be like 4 or 5 other agents making offers on the same property within your office. That's a kind of dual agency. I mean, that's actually like a triple, quadruple, or quintuple agency. So it informs the buyer that another buyer within the office may be competing on the same property. Okay. So like I said, this is delivered automatically with the purchase agreement, and here's the box. It shows that it's pre-checked. It's this one right here. I think that's supposed to be an X. It looks like a Z. I don't know. Anyway, so that's just a small form, but an important form. Okay, so now we move to the big one, the TDS. Okay, and the TDS, this was really probably the very first form which required the seller to answer specified questions. So, as I mentioned before in our history of disclosures, since the 40s and since 1963, both sellers and agents were required to disclose material facts affecting value or desirability. Well, when this one came out, this was the first one which laid out a whole series of questions which the seller was required to answer. Now, the TDS is required on residential 1 to 4 properties and manufactured homes. There are some exceptions, however, and I will definitely talk about those exceptions. But just when you think TDS, residential 1 to 4 property and mobile homes. So let's have a quick look at some of the forms here. And here's the first page of the TDS. And what I want to point out to you is a couple things. So sometimes, let's say you're a buyer's agent and you get a disclosure, you get the TDS, and it has in big letters, seller does not occupy property. Okay, you don't have to write that on the TDS, because if the seller does not occupy the property, there's a box which says exactly that. It's right there. Seller is not occupying the property. Now, what about all of these boxes? What happens if the seller, what are these boxes for? Well, these boxes are indicating the kinds of personal property or personal property fixtures or fixtures that are on the property at the time the seller fills this out, but they're not a contract to deliver these items. So a seller might check range, oven, microwave, dishwasher. These items are all currently on the property. But guess what? At close, the seller takes them. Now we get a call from the buyer's agent. Hey, this seller took these items, and even though they're checked on the TDS, and the answer is the TDS has nothing to do with it. And neither does the MLS. So if you're a buyer's agent and you see on the MLS the items, saying refrigerator, oven, stove, whatever, all that stuff, what you have to do as a buyer's agent, you have to write those items directly into the purchase agreement. It's the purchase agreement itself that controls who gets those items. So on the purchase agreement, you're going to be writing them all in under, you're going to be writing them all in under paragraph 8B of the purchase agreement. Let me double check that. I have one right in front of me, get my numbers straight. Yes, so all of those items that you see on the MLS, you write them into the contract, 8B, under 8B, and that guarantees that the buyer will have the right to those items at close. Okay. Now the next slide is the second page of the TDS, and all I want to point out to you on this one is this highlighted question I have here, that the questions are in the seller are you aware format. Seller, are you aware? So these questions are not asking for the seller to find out the answers definitively. No, they're just asking for the seller's knowledge. And if the seller doesn't know the answer, then the correct answer is no. Some sellers, you know, they freak out like, I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, well, if you don't know, the answer is no. Okay, so in general, we have, you know, a lot of sort of rules of thumb that we follow when we're discussing the TDS. And I'm just going to go through them. So in general, these are the rules. When it comes to the TDS, the agent does not fill out the TDS. It's the seller who fills it out. In fact, I don't even think ZipForm permits an agent to fill out the TDS, but that's because of this approach. It's a risk management approach. Don't fill out the TDS, the seller does. What is the role of the agent then? Well, the role of the agent is to impart to the seller the critical importance of carefully reading the questions and carefully answering the questions. So that's what you do. You're advising the seller on the importance of going through the questions. It's not just, you're not just you know, signing your name at the bottom. No, you want to read the questions, take your time, understand them, answer them truthfully. That's it. Okay. Now, the seller, as I said before, the seller is required to answer these questions, fill out the TDS, even if they have no knowledge. And in fact, the fourth bullet point here, the TDS must be fully completed. And if not, the buyer retains a cancellation right. We used to get these calls. An agent would call up saying, we got this TDS, but question 15 has been unanswered. Can we send it back and force them to answer it? And we always assumed the answer was yes, you can do that, but we didn't really know for sure. It was just an unresolved issue. But we changed the contract in 2014, and in 2014 we added the fully completed language. So now it's crystal clear that all of the questions need to be answered. Now, if the seller answers yes to any of these questions, the seller should be encouraged to elaborate on the yes answers. In fact, anytime a seller is answering yes to any question, they should provide more explanation. And there's not that much room. If we go back, you know, to the TDS, you can see here's the second page. This is where the seller would put in their explanation. There's actually not that much room to write in an explanation. And a seller should never feel constrained, constricted by the space available to limit their answer. No. If the seller needs more space, you just attach addendum. Just, you know, don't be shy. Just attach addendum and let the seller answer as much as they want. So you're looking for a full, complete answer so that the buyer is, and that's the best approach, so that the buyer has a complete awareness of the issue. And finally, the last bullet point in red, if the seller refuses to fill it out, remind the seller in writing that the law and contract may require it. This happens all the time. At least we get calls like this on the hotline all the time. So it's not a one-off thing. Now, the TDS has a cancellation right. Before I talk about the TDS cancellation, I want to remind everybody, however, that in 97% of the cases, if a seller cancels our purchase agreements, if a buyer cancels our purchase agreements, it's almost always on the basis of their broad contingency rights. So our contract has broad contingency rights for investigations, for disclosures, title, appraisal, loan, etc. And most of the time, if a buyer is getting out of the contract, it's on that basis. However, there is this TDS cancellation right, and that could come into play, for example, when the buyer has removed all of their contingencies. They don't have any contingencies. They can't cancel on that basis. They have to search around for some other reason to get out of the contract. How do they do it? Possibly the TDS. If the TDS hasn't been delivered, or it's only been delivered in the last 3 or 5 days, they can possibly cancel. So basically, the law is actually extremely clear that if this TDS hasn't been delivered, the buyer retains the cancellation right. They can just cancel. So this could actually be a more significant issue in very, very hot markets where people are making no contingent offers right and left. I make a no contingent offer, I don't get the disclosures, and then 5 days later, you know what, I changed my mind, I cancel. Can I do that? Well, did you receive a TDS? Is it a residential 1 to 4 property? If the answer to those questions are, well, if I didn't receive the TDS and it's a residential 1 to 4 property, I can cancel. That's how it works. Okay. So let's see, somebody has asked a question. You know what, actually I missed some of these questions. Let me go back here. Okay, so we're going to go back to the agency form. So for listing and selling agent, is it the name of the brokerage or the individual sales agent? Okay, so thank you for asking that question. We're going to go back. And it's the name of the brokerage. It goes here. This is the broker's name. And in fact, I think it tells you that right here. It says, if you look at this, it says firm, print firm name. So that's a reminder. Okay, what's our next question? Okay. So I'm sorry, I can't understand the question, but we'll move on. Can you have the seller fill out a TDS when you list? Yes, you can. A lot of agents, in fact, do that. I mean, that's a standard practice, which is you have the seller fill out all the disclosures at the time of taking the listing. And how long can it be applied for a sale? In other words, when does the date on the TDS become stale or null or void? The law doesn't actually get into any real specifics on this question, so without having a clear answer directly from the law, I would say you can have the seller, sign these disclosures at the time they take the list, but when the offer is presented or when the disclosures are made, when the disclosures are presented within the first 7 days of the contract, I would have the seller, review their already signed TDS and SPQ to see if they would like to amend the disclosure based upon anything that has changed since they signed them. So I think that's a conservative practice, but it makes sense because the law, as I said, is silent on this issue. Okay, so somebody's asking, what do you do if you list a custom home? And that sort of asks about the exceptions to various disclosures, and I'm going to talk about the exceptions right now. How about that? And frankly, there's no custom home exception, so you don't really do anything differently. Oh, a brand new custom home. Okay, so brand new custom home. Okay, let's hold back on that one right now. I'll give you the brief answer, which is the disclosures for new homes are rather complicated, but we do have an extremely, extremely good disclosure chart on our website. We have what's something called the new home disclosure chart. It was written up a while ago. We updated it, of course. But the attorney that did it did a very good job. And if you want to get a sort of a complete detail of all the legally required disclosures on a new construction property, then you look at that chart. But in general, when you have, so I'm going to we'll look at these exemptions right now. So TDS is required on residential 1 to 4. There are some exemptions. The major exemptions are REOs and foreclosures, probate, bankruptcy sales, government entities, trusts, and trusts are sometimes exempt. So those are the exemptions that most agents on a day-to-day basis come across. These are the most important ones. Now, there actually is a new home exemption, but not for every new home. It's primarily when a white report has been issued, and that is when the sale has to be basically pre-cleared by the Department of Real Estate. You apply for a white report. And in that circumstance, no TDS is required. And there's even, it's a little tricky, but new homes can, typically if it's a subdivision of 5 new homes or more, they can qualify for the exemption. Otherwise, there isn't an exemption. Okay, but anyway, we're going to stick with these more basic exemptions, the ones that are much more common. So the REOs and foreclosures, keep in mind what an REO is. An REO is not some guy who buys a property at a foreclosure auction and then resells. That's not an REO. An REO is when it's like a bank or a note holder who's not getting paid on their note, on their lien. And because they're not getting paid, they foreclose themselves. They are the foreclosing lien holder, and they take the property back at foreclosure because nobody bids more than the value of the debt owed on the property. And then they resell. That is an REO. So they get the exemption. No TDS is required on that kind of sale. Same for probate. If it's a probate, no TDS. No TDS on bankruptcy. Now, trusts are a little bit tricky because the exemption, you sometimes get the exemption with trust. So this is how it works. If you have an irrevocable trust, you always get the exemption. Okay, well, what's an irrevocable trust? An irrevocable trust is, let's say I own property right now, and I'm alive, and I put my property into a trust. Well, I'm alive. I can put my property into the trust. I can take it out. I can designate the successor trustee. I can designate the beneficiaries. I can change my mind at any time. My nephew didn't send me a thank you card. I take him out. He's no longer a beneficiary. As long as I'm alive, I can do that. That is a revocable trust. Revocable. Now, the minute I pass away, the trust becomes irrevocable. It's fixed. The trustee is set. The beneficiaries are set. The job of the trustee at that point is to distribute the assets of the trust. That's irrevocable. So, irrevocable trusts are exempt. So all irrevocable trusts are exempt. Revocable trusts are usually not exempt. However, if you have 2 trustees on a revocable trust, so even 2 trustees on a revocable trust, you still get the exemption. So if it's just me, a single trustee on my revocable trust, I don't get the exemption. I have to fill out the TDS. But 2 trustees on a revocable trust, they get the exemption on the TDS. Don't ask me why. It's a quirk in the law. Doesn't make sense, but that's it. Okay. So those are the standard exemptions. Now, we have we get a lot of questions about exemptions which don't really exist at all. And I call these phantom exemptions. So we'll just go through them here. The as-is exemption, there's no as-is exemption. So if you sell a property as-is, you still have all the same exemptions. I'm sorry, you still have all the same disclosure obligations as you would on a regular sale. There's really nothing special about as-is in terms of disclosures. Okay, we did have a question here. Could the 2 trustees be husband and wife? Yes, they could. So a husband and wife co-trustees on a revocable trust, they could very well be entitled to the TDS exemption. Okay, short sale. Short sale is not an exemption to the TDS. Short sale sellers have all the same disclosure obligations. Short sales are a weird kind of sale in a way because even though the seller is not realizing any gain from the sale, they actually have all of the liabilities for misrepresentation and non-disclosure. Anyway, there's nothing special about short sales in terms of disclosures. Flipper investor, there's no exemption there. We get a lot of calls from agents who tell us, well, my investor doesn't know anything about this property. He only bought it 2 months ago. And I'm very skeptical of that, because I find that investors often know a great deal about the property. They've done very thorough inspections. Maybe they've even done some remodeling. They've got estimates all across the board. So don't take the side of the seller in arguing they don't know anything about the property. No, that's not the correct approach. The correct approach is to tell the seller they have an obligation to disclose all these different things, and that's what they should be doing. Corporations, there's no exemption there. There's no out-of-state exemption. Doesn't matter where you live. China, Antarctica, Vermont. Teardown, there's no exemption for that. Sorry. I don't know anything about this property is not an exemption. Seller does not occupy the property is not an exemption. FSBO. So what about FSBO's sellers? Sellers who are not represented. There is no special exemption for a FSBO. They have all the same disclosure obligations. The only thing that they really do differently is there's no agent visual inspection, because they're not a professional agent. Interestingly, we often get a call, how does a buyer's agent handle working with a FSBO? And the way a buyer's agent handles this, well, the main concern here is, should a buyer working with a buyer approaching a FSBO, should that buyer be a dual agent or not? Well, if you're a buyer, generally speaking, you don't want to be a dual agent if you can help it, because that's taking on a lot more risk. So if you want to work with a FSBO and not represent the FSBO, then there's a couple things that you need to be doing. One, you need to establish right off the bat you're not representing the FSBO. And you do that by making it very, very clear. You provide the seller with what's called the Seller Non-Agency Form, SNA, Seller Non-Agency Form. And it tells the seller, I'm not representing you. Now, if you want to get paid by the seller, you can do that. You would use the Form SP. That stands for Single Party Compensation Agreement. You need to be very careful to check the box indicating you're representing the buyer exclusively. So you got your seller non-agency, establishing that you're not representing the seller. You have your SP, indicating that the seller will pay you. The final icing on the cake is when the offer is presented, you will fill out the confirmation indicating you're representing the buyer exclusively. So there you have it. That's how you do it. Okay, power of attorney. There's no power of attorney exemption, and I would say when you're working with a holder of a power of attorney, an attorney in fact, when you're working with an attorney in fact, you always want to advise that that person that they need to have the true seller, the true title holder, fill out both the TDS and the SPQ. Always, always, always get that in writing. It would be better to have the true owner fill out the TDS and SPQ. Now, oftentimes the power of attorney holder will say, well, they can't do it. They're not able. Okay. Let them figure that out. If they're not able to do it, they're not able to do it. But from your perspective, you're advising them to do it, and that's what matters. Okay. Relos. So a relocation sale, usually you have a well-heeled seller, somebody who's working for a big corporation, and that seller is being moved, say from California to Texas. So the company takes care of everything for them, and one of the things they do is they hire a relocation company. So the relocation company will take title to the property, and then they will act as the seller to sell to a buyer. Okay. Well, that raises a question. What are the disclosure obligations of the original seller to the buyer? And the Shapiro case answers this question. So basically, in the Shapiro case, you have a seller working through a relo company. The seller deeded the property over to the relo company, but didn't really make any disclosures to the relo company. And then, of course, the relocation company sold to the buyer, and they didn't know anything because they're just a third-party, company. Well, the buyer ended up buying property, and there was some major thing which was not disclosed. I don't know what it was. The buyer sued. The buyer sued the relocation company and the seller. Well, the relocation company was found not liable because they truthfully provided the information that they knew, which wasn't very much. However, the seller was found liable because, in essence, the seller had failed to make the appropriate disclosures to the relocation company. And it was foreseeable that that fraud, so to speak, would transfer over to the buyer. So the buyer was able to hold the seller once removed, the previous seller, liable for, in essence, defrauding the relo company, because it was foreseeable that that same fraud would then, that the buyer themselves, a buyer down the line, would suffer for that failure to disclose. Okay. So we have a question. As a buyer's agent, do we ask FSBOs to complete the TDS? Okay, so getting back to the FSBO, what should the approach be when you're working with this FSBO who doesn't really know what they're doing? Okay, so you started out by telling the seller that I'm not representing you. You expressed the same idea in the SP form, and on the purchase agreement, you've confirmed that you're representing the buyer exclusively. I'd say during the transaction, of course, you probably have to work closely with the seller to, in essence, educate them as to their obligations, and that's okay. So you can provide the seller with you can tell the seller everything everything that they're required to do, but I would put on a cover letter to the seller something like this: Seller, as you know, I'm representing the buyer exclusively, and however, you are required to provide blah 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 blah. So you can communicate freely with the seller, but just remind them at critical junctures, as you know, I'm representing the buyer exclusively, and that way there can be no confusion that somehow this exclusive agency with the buyer is now a dual agency. No, and that's how you handle that. Okay. Now, for these TDS, we do have what I call the TDS cheat sheet. So when you have an exempt sale, like a trust or a probate, then you can attach these forms, the TA form, the PA form, to both the purchase agreement and the listing. And these forms, you don't fill them out. They just tell the seller and the buyer what the duties of the seller are, what the disclosure obligations of the seller are. So they put everybody on the same page. They let the seller know what disclosures they have to make in this particular type of transaction. And for the buyer, they let the buyer know what types of disclosures they should expect to receive. Okay, so that concludes the big one, the TDS. We have a couple of installation and certification type slides, and I'm going to sort of run through them pretty quickly, and then I'm going to spend a bit more time on the new water. Well, it's no longer new, but relatively new water conserving plumbing fixture laws. Okay, so smoke alarms. Basically, you need to install smoke alarms on all dwelling units intended for human occupancy in accordance with the requirements at the time of installation. Now, before August 1992, one smoke alarm in the hallway next to the bedrooms. But after this date, you have also one smoke alarm in the bedrooms next to the hallways, but additionally in every bedroom. And at any time after the property is remodeled with $1,000 or more permitted improvements, then you increase to the higher location standard, one in each bedroom plus one in the hallway next to the bedrooms. Skip this one. Water heater bracing. Now, water heater bracing isn't based upon the type of property or when it was built. It's based upon the water heater. So it's a little different. So in order to know whether your water heater has to be braced, then these three criteria need to be met. If you have a standard water heater with a capacity of not more than 120 gallons, a kind of smallish water heater, for which a pre-engineered strapping kit is readily available, the water heater must be braced. So those instant water heaters, don't have to brace them. So anything that's too funky, it's not a standard water heater, doesn't have to be braced, but most water heaters will be braced. The CO detector installation requirements, well, you put that on any property, any residential property in which there's a fossil fuel burning appliance or fireplace or attached garage. Okay, so in addition to the installation requirements, so the obligation of the seller to install both or all three of the smoke alarm, water heater, CO, you have what are called the statement of compliance requirements. It's not enough. It's not enough just to install them. The seller also has to say, I swear I am going to have these things installed, or I swear these things will be installed prior to close. Now, if you're using the TDS, the certification for both the water heater bracing and the smoke alarms is right there at the bottom of page 2. So let me go back and show you where it is. I blew it up on that slide, but so here we are on page 1. Here we are on page 2. Let me erase this ink. Okay, so that blown up portion is right here at the bottom of the page. This is page 2 of the TDS. That's the certification. So that's what I'm showing you here. So the seller is certifying that these things will be complied with. And if you have a TDS, you're good. Not legally required to have anything further. Now, some brokerages, they require you to use the WHS or the WHSD in addition to the TDS. So some will do that. And the question is, can they do that? And the answer is yes. The broker gets to decide what are the required forms within their office. In fact, not only do they get to decide, they have a legal obligation to decide. The broker is legally obliged to set the rules of the brokerage. That's their duty. Their duty is to supervise the agent, set the rules, set out policies, train them, etc. So if the broker has a list of forms to be used, whether or not they're strictly legally required, you're going to follow them. That's how it works. Okay, but in terms of just pure legal requirements, the TDS suffices. Now, if there's no TDS because it's, let's say it's a probate, TDS exempt, right? Then you can use the form WHS or WHSD, and that will suffice. Now, there is technically no legally required form for the carbon monoxide. So for the carbon monoxide, we have a form here. See, it's not required, not required. It's optional. The form CMD is optional. Now it's the WCMD. We changed the form name because we added something, but it's optional. Okay. So let's look at the relatively new water heater conserving. It's a more interesting, in my opinion, it's a little bit more interesting to talk about, and it's relatively new. It came into effect this year in January. So this law is actually not a new law. Well, actually, let me see if I had any questions first. Let's see if there's any lingering questions. So we had one question. So, right, sometimes buyer's agents don't want to sign, but do they have to? They don't want to sign what? What is it they don't want to sign? Well, anyway, we'll get going. Okay, they don't. The redundant water heater. Okay, if you receive, if you're a listing agent and you want to provide any disclosure, whether it's optional or not, okay, because let's say the brokerage requires it as their office policy, you're going to follow a similar procedure each time. You're going to present the information, you know, hopefully in a way which documents the fact that you've presented it, and then you wait. If they don't sign and return it, then you call or email asking them to do so. And all you're really trying to do is document that you made these efforts in order to prove that it was in fact delivered. Signing these disclosures is not agreeing to the disclosures. All you're doing is you're acknowledging, you're trying to get an acknowledgement of receipt. So it's not critical that they sign them. Of course, you'd like to have them signed because signing is the gold standard. Something signed, it's pretty clear that it was received, right? Can't deny it then. But if they don't, you'll make several requests. You'll, in a way which shows that the requests were made through email, for example, and that's what you do. So that's the approach. Okay, so water conserving plumbing fixtures. So like I was saying, this is not a new law, even though it came into effect in 2017. It's actually an older law. It was passed originally in 2009. There was just a lot of lead time. But a very important piece of this law came into effect this year on January 1st. So on January 1st, 2017, homeowners of single-family properties across the state were required to install water-conserving plumbing fixtures if the property was built before 1994. Now, compliance requires installation of water-conserving plumbing fixtures, toilets, shower heads, faucets, even urinals if your single-family property had a urinal. But, and this is the important point, but this is not a point of sale requirement. So the law does not require installation because you're selling your home. No. So installing water-conserving plumbing fixtures is simply required by virtue of owning a home. So in other words, if you own a home, the installation of the water-conserving plumbing fixtures is now a requirement, regardless of whether you're selling it. Okay. Now, this seems like a very subtle difference, but it's an important difference, especially for agents, because what it means is because the water-conserving plumbing fixture does not create a point-of-sale requirement, there is no obligation on either agents or brokers to ensure that the sellers or buyers install water-conserving plumbing fixtures. So CAR worked very hard for years to make sure that this was not a point-of-sale requirement. And we succeeded. It's not. So that does make a lot of difference for the agents. So what is required, however? So I guess, yeah, that's the point. What is required? Well, as I said, there's no point-of-sale requirement. However, as in all transactions, agents should impress upon the seller the necessity of carefully and accurately completing the appropriate disclosure forms. And there's a couple things to be aware of. So you have all of those boxes on the first page of the TDS. and the seller is going to indicate that the property has these certain items. I showed them before, and I'm going to jump back and show you what box actually pertains to these water-conserving plumbing fixtures. You might not have ever noticed it. So here we are on the first page of the TDS. Let me erase the ink on this slide. And we go all the way to the very bottom right-hand corner, water-conserving plumbing fixtures. Did you ever notice that one? So it's there. And the way I would handle it what I would do if I were the seller, if I wasn't sure whether my water-conserving plumbing fixtures were compliant, I'd probably leave it blank. So I mean, really, that's the thing to do. You don't know, don't check it. Now, in addition to that first disclosure item, there's also a new question on the SPQ and ESD. And the question is, are you aware of any non-compliant plumbing fixtures? So the question is, are you aware? And the seller might think, well, how would I know this? How does a seller know? And it's actually very easy to know whether you have water-conserving plumbing fixtures. If you have to flush the toilet 2 or 3 times, you are clearly in compliance. Ha, that's a joke. Okay, so seriously, there are standards here. If your toilet is manufactured to use 1.6 gallons per flush, if it's manufactured to use more than 1.6 gallons per flush, that's non-compliant. So, seller, are you aware of any non-compliant plumbing fixtures on your property? The answer would then be yes. Okay. Now, if you remember, like in the 70s, when I was growing up, it's a while back, there was the drought. We've had a lot of droughts since then, but at least in my mind, this was the original one. So, and they stopped serving water in restaurants. Well, they still served it. You had to ask for it, which is so ridiculous. But anyway, at that time, you remember people would save water, and oftentimes they'd save water by putting a brick in their toilet. So that actually saves water, because you're displacing, water within the toilet tank. However, that would not be in compliance with this law, because this law asks, is the toilet manufactured to use more than 1.6 gallons per flush? It doesn't ask, are you using more than 1.6 gallons? It's manufactured. So putting a brick in the toilet tank would save water, but it wouldn't put you in compliance. I mean, I guess somebody could just take the brick out. I think that's the idea. In any event, in order to allow sellers to figure it out, we have a new form. Well, actually, what we did is we changed an old form. We had the CMD for the carbon detection, the carbon monoxide detection devices, but now we combined it. So now it's called the Water Conserving Plumbing Fixtures and Carbon Monoxide Detector Notice, and it provides an explanation to the sellers. It's an optional form, but it could be required by your broker. And the seller is like, great, I have this info. Now what do I do? and ultimately, an agent might be tempted to tell the seller whether they have water-conserving plumbing fixtures or not, but really the agent shouldn't be making shouldn't be giving that advice. So unless you're some type of expert, the seller needs to consult with somebody who has expertise in plumbing fixtures, like a plumber or a contractor, or perhaps a retrofit company. Here in LA, there's a lot of companies which specialize in retrofitting properties for sale. They would probably be able to tell you. Okay. Finally, number 3 is a statement of the law. Nothing needs to be answered there or filled out, but that's already in the TDS. If you were to go back, look at the TDS on the second page, there's a lot of fine print before you get to the main "Are you aware?" questions, and that fine print includes a statement of the law explaining that the seller is obliged to install water-conserving plumbing fixtures if it's a single-family property built before 1994. What's this? Well, as I said before, if we go back to number 2 here, right, number 2, new question on the SPQ or ASD, well, that's what this is right here. This is the new question is blown up. It says, are you, seller, aware of plumbing fixtures on the property that are non-compliant plumbing fixtures as defined by Civil Code 1101.3? Very complicated stuff. I mean, the problem with this question, I don't like it, is if you're a seller and you don't really know the answer, normally if you don't know the answer, you want to check no, I don't know. But with this one, in order to err on the side of caution, you really should be checking yes. Seller, are you aware of non-compliant plumbing fixtures on the property? Well, I don't know. I'll check yes just to be safe, and then I'll write any sort of explanation here. I don't know. So with the question where are you aware? It's actually on. I've hidden it. I don't think I can change it on this slide, but if you look at this form, exempt seller disclosure, these are all "are you aware" questions down here on the side. So it's right here. Okay. Am I muted? Can somebody said I'm muted now? Can you hear me? Oh, good. Okay, thank goodness. Otherwise, I would have been talking into air for like the last 5 minutes. Okay, so I think we're gonna. What time is it? It's 11. It's been an hour, has it? And we're just gonna take a break right now. Maybe we'll take a break until 11:10, and then we'll pick up with the visual inspection. And so take a break right now, and we'll come back at 11:10, and we'll get started with the visual inspection. All right? Great. Okay. I'm back. And as promised, we're going to pick up with the visual inspection. Okay. So what can I tell you about the visual inspection? Well, this law was passed around the same time as the TDS and was in response to a very well-known case. Well, I think it's well-known. Who knows? The Eastern versus Strasburger case. So the Eastern versus Strasburger case was this circumstance where you had a property, and the property was sort of located on a hillside. The agents noticed that there was some netting on the hillside, I guess holding back, the hill. And on top of that, they also noted uneven flooring of the property. So what does this indicate? Netting on the hillside, uneven flooring, indicates geological instability. And apparently, though, this wasn't really reported to the buyer. Well, after close, the whole hillside gave way, and the property was destroyed. And in fact, the sale was a complete loss because it wasn't, the property was no longer buildable. The buyer sued and was able to hold the agents liable. Now, the significance of this was previously, as I said before, going back to the Lynx versus Savage case from 1963, previously there was a duty to disclose material facts affecting value or desirability. But basically, essentially, facts based upon knowledge. Well, what the Eastern versus Strasburger case said was it wasn't enough for agents to simply disclose things they knew. The agents had a duty to investigate and find out. So that's a big difference. And as a result, this law was passed. This law was passed as an effort to kind of restrict the scope of the Eastern versus Strasburger case. So you essentially had this kind of this duty as laid out in a case, but the law attempted to restrict it to some extent and make it understandable and something which an agent could actually follow in a prescribed manner, make it doable. Anyway, so the visual inspection is going to be required on residential 1 to 4 properties and manufactured homes, but unlike the TDS, there are nearly no exemptions. So it doesn't matter if you have a probate or a trust or an REO, you're still doing the visual inspection. Now there's 2 different forms available. You can use the 3rd page of the TDS, or you can use the AVID form. Either one suffices, although a lot of brokers will require the AVID form. Both the listing and the buyer's agents are required to do a visual inspection. Okay, so here's the 3rd page of the TDS, and up until about 8 or 9 years ago, this is the only thing that agents use. You have the four lines, you write your notes, this is the visual inspection, or if there was nothing that you noticed, you could check the box saying, agent notes no items for disclosure. So question is, if you're double ending a transaction, can you use only one AVID? Yes, you can. So not required to have 2 if in fact it's a dual agency. But I would say in most dual agencies, there's still going to be 2 produced because the agents, even though it's a dual agency, they're different agents. And that's okay. Okay, so 8 or 9 years ago, this is all that was done. Well, about that time, CAR introduced the AVID form. So the AVID form is an optional form, but it's highly recommended. And the broker, of course, can require it. You use the AVID form by attaching it to the 3rd page of the TDS. You check the box, see attached AVID. Or if it was a TDS exempt transaction like a probate or trust, you can use it as a standalone form. Now, what is so great? What's so great about the Avid? Why do we recommend it? Well, you can see here as we compare it from the third page of the TDS to the Avid, you can see that it has a lot more space and it's a lot more systematic. It's a systematic review of the property room by room. It creates a list and prompts you to put in a description at the correct level of detail, and that's room by room. So in my opinion, it makes your visual inspection highly credible. So if you're ever on a witness stand defending your visual inspection, what would you rather have? What form would you rather be defending? Would you rather be defending the TDS with these 4 skimpy lines, or would you rather be defending the Avid? I think you'd want to go with the Avid. So the main question then is, well, how do you do the visual inspection? And the basic rule is agents look for and disclose material facts affecting the value or desirability of the property. That's how you do it. But before we get to how you do it, I want to take a little bit of time to explain how you don't do it, what you're not required to do. And these were written into the law, as I was explaining, a way to sort of circumscribe the requirements of the Eastern versus Strasburger case. So what the law says is that the agent's not required to inspect areas that are not normally or reasonably accessible, areas offside of the property, public records. They're not required to pull public records or permits as part of the visual inspection, that is. And they're not required to look at the common areas of a condo or planned development. If we expand upon what these ideas, we can say that, for example, not normally or reasonably accessible means you don't have to look on the roof and attic. Well, I mean, if you're standing on the ground and you see a big hole in the roof, of course you'll write that down, but you don't have to go onto the roof or into the attic, not normally or reasonably accessible. You don't have to look behind or move furniture, look under the house or climb hillsides, all of this stuff. You don't have to do that. You don't have to operate appliances to determine their functionality, because that's not a visual inspection. And you don't have to measure square footage. In fact, you should never measure square footage. Agents should not be measuring square footage. As an agent, you're always going to be relying upon somebody else's measurement. You're going to indicate that. You come up with a flyer, you know, you put down the square footage per the assessor, per the appraiser, per the seller, whoever. That's what you're going to do, but not measure it yourself. And you're not going to determine if the property has mold, asbestos, or other environmental hazards, because we don't believe you're in the business of being a toxicologist. And that's a risk management approach. And again, you're not required to pull permits as part of the visual inspection. We've written all of this stuff onto the first page of the Avid, so if you ever want to review it, like let's say if you ever want to sort of get a more hands-on approach and a refresher or review this information, you can read through this information on the first page of the TDS. It's right there. So that's what you don't do. And that leaves the question, well then, what do you do? How do you do it? And again, you start off with look for and disclose material facts affecting value or desirability. Now, for the visual inspection, you want to stick to facts. You see green and black discoloration in bathroom 1, you write that. Green and black discoloration, bathroom 1. Don't speculate. So you don't want to write something like mold of the toxic variety. You don't know if it's toxic. You don't know if it's surface mold. Maybe it goes really deep. Is it easily cleaned? It could be, but maybe not. Caused by a leak in the caulking. You generally want to stay away from explaining the cause of anything. What if it turns out that wasn't the cause? And in general, we don't even like the idea of you saying mold. So again, we don't think agents need to be held to the standard of an environmental toxicologist to figure out whether there is mold or asbestos or any of these other things. So you'll want to stick to green and black discoloration. Now, you don't want to guess at the adequacy of repairs, because that will get you into trouble, again, if your guess turns out to be wrong. You can definitely be specific by indicating the location of any material fact, but you don't have to go beyond your expertise. So the example here is 3/16 of an inch slope in the entryway. Well, if you're a contractor, I suppose you can do that, but an agent isn't required to give that level of detail. It's beyond the expertise that an agent normally and has as part of the custom of the industry. The duty of the agent in doing the visual inspection is to identify red flags. Red flags would be anything like cracks, stains, discoloration, spots, peeling paint, popcorn ceiling. So you don't have to say asbestos. You see popcorn ceiling, that's what you write, popcorn ceiling. Uneven flooring, warping floors, any type of damage that you notice. It says identify red flags. And red flag, of course, is a metaphor, but it's actually more than a metaphor, because in the Easton versus Strasburger case, the judge actually used the phrase red flags. The judge said that is the duty of the agent to identify red flags. So even though it's a metaphor with like legal significance. It's the law. That's the law. When the judge wrote the case, that's the law. So more than a metaphor. Risk management attorneys who handle these types of litigation, this type of litigation out in the field, they tell us to stay away from describing the size, significance, or degree of defect. Don't say large spots or small spots, just say spots. Don't say big crack, just crack. I guess the idea there is that if you minimize the significance by saying small cracks or large cracks, then that implies that it wasn't so significant. Or if you say large cracks somewhere and you don't use the same adjective in some other description, it again minimizes something which could be very important. So they tell you don't use those kinds of adjectives. Watch your language. No problems whatsoever and remodeled all over. So these are two real examples. I was up in Sacramento. I gave this presentation, and one of the brokers came up to me during a break, and he says, "Hey, we got a visual inspection from a listing side one time. It said no problems whatsoever. I'd like you to emphasize this as the incorrect approach." And I thought it was a good idea. I incorporated into the class. You write something like no problems whatsoever, you're really asking for liability when problems do arise after close. Remodeled all over, that was taken from a call that I had. I spoke with an agent, and 6 months after close, the buyer was complaining to her about what she had written. It was true that the property had been remodeled in a great many places, but it hadn't been remodeled all over. So, I mean, that was the problem. So you have to be careful in what you write. Do not endorse the seller's statements. So the idea here is that if you write something like appears as stated by seller, and the seller's wrong, then you're basically endorsing the negligent statements of the seller. So the advice is stay away from that kind of explanation. Again, the AVID is a recommended form. We recommend that you use the AVID. And some agents will ask us, well, I'd like to include a general advisory urging a professional inspection on the AVID. And you can do that. I mean, we already have language there, but it doesn't hurt to rewrite it in handwriting. Handwriting actually has more significance from the point of view of the law than pre-printed language. And if you wanted to do that, we came up with some language that you could write into the AVID form. Quote, broker recommends that buyer conduct inspections, tests, surveys, or other studies with a professional buyers choosing to investigate the property, unquote. I mean, don't get carried away with how important that is. It's not really that important. It's not going to save you if you've made some of these other mistakes. Okay, so somebody asks, if the agent is a licensed contractor, do they need to be that specific? It's an interesting question. If you are an agent and you're also a licensed contractor, it really depends on whether you've held yourself out as a licensed contractor. If you made a big deal of this, hey, I'm a licensed contractor, you put in your advertisements, and you can rely on me because of my expertise, then you probably have to actually adhere to the standard of a licensed contractor. You know, we know a lot of agents have legal backgrounds. A lot have actually gone to law school. Well, if they're an attorney, they may have even passed the bar. If they're an attorney, are they held to the standard of an attorney? Well, if they've held themselves out as an attorney, then they would probably be held to that standard. So, you know, they would be required to provide the correct tax advice and other types of advice regarding title. However complicated it is, if it's something an attorney should have been telling you, then they could be held to that standard. So it really depends upon how they've presented themselves. Now somebody asks, when can you do the visual inspection? Can we do them late? And the answer here, wait, I think I have the answer on the next slide. Yes, right here at the bottom. So the visual inspection needs to be done within 7 days after acceptance. That's the latest it can be done, and that's going to be true for both the buyer and seller, for both the buyer's agent and the listing agent. So it used to be that we didn't have a statement in the contract as to when the visual had to be done, but it became confusing. So as part of the changes to the contract in 2014, we threw that in there, and now it's clear. The visual inspection needs to be done within the first 7 days after acceptance. So agents, beware of this trap. So even if the transaction is exempt from the TDS, you know, you may still have to do it if it's a residential 1 to 4, such as a probate, some trust, an REO. And the second bullet point, the visual inspection is not required on vacant land, commercial, and industrial properties. Okay, so where are we on this thing? Oh, you know where we are? We're still basically on the TDS, if you can believe it. Everything we've been talking about is in some way related to the TDS, with the exception of the first agency disclosure and the PRBS. Everything is really talking about the TDS, and this is true for the seller property questionnaire as well. So allow me to explain. Since 2014, the seller property questionnaire is required on CAR residential contracts whenever the TDS is required. So TDS is required because it's residential 1 to 4 without TDS exemption. The SPQ is required. So TDS, SPQ, they go together. Now, what is the TDS? TDS is a 4-page form. It's designed to jog the memory of the seller so they don't forget to disclose. I mean, that's what we're doing here. The practice is, over the last 50 years, basically, as a risk management approach, the practice is to disclose, and brokers and attorneys have figured out that this is the best way to avoid liability, is to fully disclose. And that's what the seller property questionnaire allows the seller to do. It allows them to think through problems and to answer questions. That's why they need to read it carefully, even though it seems kind of tedious and tiresome. They need to read it carefully and answer questions. Now, the first 10 questions, they're going to be, it's a little bit complicated, but But basically, the first 10 questions, in a sense, are legally required because there's a lot of extraneous disclosure issues which are within the contract or within law, and it sort of ties up those loose ends. But the next 3 pages are basically all about getting the seller to disclose material facts. Now, if you don't have, and I'm sorry I don't have a picture of the SPQ, but just keep in mind it's a 4-page form. The first page is sort of perfunctory questions which are tying up loose ends. And the next 3 questions are kind of exacting, detailed questions all about the property. Now, if you have a residential 1 to 4 property, but it's TDS exempt, so that there's no TDS is required, then the SPQ is not required. So if you have a TDS, the SPQ is required, but if you don't have the TDS, there's no SPQ. In lieu of the SPQ, the seller will fill out the form ESD, which stands for Exempt Seller Disclosure. So it's going to be required on residential purchase agreements where it's TDS exempt. And in fact, I have a picture of this. This is it. So this is the first page of this is the ESD, but it's also really the first page of the SPQ. And again, if we look at all of these questions, what are they asking? They're asking the seller to disclose various legally required disclosures. And why is it on this form? Well, it's on this form because these are really sort of extraneous, loose disclosures which don't have their own home, so to speak, and we've included them all in the single form, which ties together all of the seller duties. Okay, maybe too much of an explanation there. Sorry. Okay, if you completed an AVID when you took the listing, are you required to complete another one within 7 days of the RPA? No, I would say not. I mean, I suppose the same advice would be true, which is maybe you do one last double check to make sure that everything's the same, that there haven't been changes on the property between the time you did your first visual inspection and when you get into contract. But I mean, in general, I think you don't have to complete it within the first 7 days. You could probably complete it, before you actually get into contract or when you take the listing at that time. But I mean, just keep in mind that the visual inspection should reflect the condition of the property at the time it is sold. So you do want to amend it if there's any changes to the condition of the property. Okay. Now, I've included this slide just for your edification, just for your own knowledge, so you have an idea of what's going on here with these disclosures. So basically, there's 4 kinds of disclosures. 4. And I've discussed all of them already, but I just want to, give you this analysis so you can better understand what's happening. So the first kind are judge-made disclosures. And those were the original disclosures going back to the 40s and in 1963 Lynx versus Savage case, where judges heard cases involving irate buyers, basically. And in those cases, they handed out decisions which said, seller, you have a duty to disclose material facts affecting buyer desirability. So that's a judge-made disclosure law. And then you have legislatively required disclosures. The legislature, in their wisdom, passed laws in which the seller is required to answer specified questions. That's the TDS. The TDS is a legislatively required disclosure. Then you have contractually required disclosures. That's the SPQ. So there's no law which says the seller will fill out the SPQ. There's no judge that says the seller will fill out the SPQ. Why is the seller filling it out? Because the contract is requiring them to do so. So it's a contract. The buyer and seller have entered into an agreement, and in that agreement it says, seller, you will fill out this form and give it to me. So it's contractually required forms. And then we have these other forms which are completely optional, really, from a legal perspective. They're not required by any judge, any legislature, any contract. They're risk management forms. An example of that would be the WCMD, the Water Conserving Plumbing Fixture and Carbon Monoxide Disclosure Notice. So it's a risk management form, not technically required by anything. The brokerage can require it, but it's just done for, you know, everyone's overall benefit. So 4 types of disclosures, something to keep in mind. Okay, we're going to move on to the natural hazard zones. And so there's 6 of them. You have 2 flood, 2 fire, 2 earthquake. And the takeaway from this slide, what I want you to realize looking at this one, is that these zones, the seller is required to disclose for every kind of transaction: vacant land, commercial, industrial, residential 4, residential 5+, doesn't matter. The seller is required to disclose whether the property sits in one of these hazard zones. And for that, the listing side will almost always order an NHD. I mean, that's the standard practice now, and it's that way for a reason. So you're almost always going to be ordering an NHD as part of the transaction. Now, the duty to disclose that the property is within one of the zones is actually a little bit different from the natural hazard disclosure statement. So the natural hazard disclosure statement is a summary of the zones, and this law was only passed in 1999. It's for the benefit of consumer purchasers on residential 1 to 4 properties. So this form is required on residential 1 to 4. The exemptions are nearly identical to the TDS. It also has cancellation rights similar to the TDS. You never really have to provide this form separately because it's almost always, I mean, it is always provided with the NHD report. So the report's ordered from a reporting company, and they'll always include this natural hazard disclosure statement. So you don't, it's very rare, I can hardly think of a situation where this would have to somehow be provided separately. And believe it or not, we're still on the TDS. We're still talking about issues which involve TDS in some way. And I've prepared this slide called the TDS family of disclosures. There's a whole set of disclosures which are, in essence, incorporated into the TDS law. They are required on residential 1 to 4 properties, same as the TDS. They have the same exemptions for the most part, and they have similar cancellation rights, although you don't really hear about this at all. That's what, but that technical law says it. So these are all within, if you go into the Civil Code 1102, that's the TDS law, you'll see all of these disclosures there. So what are they? Well, I've talked about most of them: TDS, the NHD, the Mello-Roos, the 1915 Bond Act, that's part of the TDS family of disclosures. As an agent or somebody working within the office, maybe a TC, the one thing to be aware about the Mello-Roos and 1915 Bond Act disclosures is that our contract, our standard RPA contract, requires that the NHD report contain these tax reports. Okay. Now, I've looked at some NHD companies to see if they normally provide the tax reports with the NHD report, and almost all of them do, but not all of them. Sometimes you have to pay extra for the tax reports. So as an agent or broker or TC within your company, you want to double check to make sure that the tax reports for Mello-Roos and 1915 Bond Act are included within the NHD. They usually are, but if they're not, you might have to pay extra for them. Okay. Now, we're going to look at the SBSA. What is the SBSA? Well, the SBSA actually, if we think about that previous slide that I had involving the types of different disclosures, the SBSA is a little of optional and a little of required, but it's mostly optional. It's primarily a risk management form, not technically legally required, but highly recommended. This is a 12-page general disclosure. It does not have to be provided. It's not normally provided from the listing side to the buyer's side. It's usually provided by the buyer's agent directly to the buyer. Some listing agents have complained that they don't want to see a 12-page general disclosure with the offer. It's just too cumbersome. But it's nice to get confirmation that the buyer has in fact received it nonetheless. And so usually it's provided by the buyer's agent directly to their own buyer. Now, this form does not replace the local broker's in-house disclosures. It's a supplement to that. And what is the point of this form? Okay. Well, real property is actually very, very complicated. It's so complicated that you could be working in real estate for decades and not even have a clue as to like half the things that could come up. And what I think is that this form SBSA, this 12-page general disclosure form, it represents the accumulated wisdom of agents and brokers and attorneys built up over decades. So after close, let's say 6 months after close, your buyer comes back and says, hey, you never told me that my house was built with Chinese drywall. You never told me that. And you're right. I never did tell you that. But you know what? If you provided the SBSA, then maybe you did tell the buyer about that. And you'd be surprised what you told the buyer when you provide this form. So if we get calls along those lines, hey, you never told me about Chinese drywall, you never told me about the golf balls, you never told me that I had to build a safety fence around my pool. And we get calls like that, and the very first thing I ask the agent is, well, did you provide the SBSA? Because if you did, you may have very well informed the buyer of this potential issue. So it's a good form to be used. It can come in handy. Okay, and let's see if I have any questions. Who chose the artwork? I chose the artwork. Yes, it's the we gotta have fun some way around here. So choosing the artwork is basically the way I entertain myself. Okay, is there a date cutoff for providing the earthquake checklist? All of the disclosures need to be provided within the first 7 days after acceptance of the offer. Is that what you're asking, when you provide it? So, but if you're asking how old or at what point does the disclosure become stale, unfortunately it's the same answer, which is none of these laws have any statement like that. There's no statement as to what point the disclosure is, quote, stale. So, I mean, with the NHD, of course, it's problematic, but because you don't want to have to pay for an additional NHD. So I would say, you know, provide it really at the time the offer is accepted. That's when you can generate it and have it sent over. At least you know it's not going to be stale for that transaction. Oh, the date the property was built. There's no, that would be on the title report, I believe. So there's not going to be any disclosure in our documents as to when the property was built, but that would be on the title report, I think. Okay, so we're going to look at material facts and go through some in detail some of these ideas here. So again, case law requires disclosure of known facts, material affecting value or desirability. The second bullet point, the duty to disclose material facts is an independent duty for both the seller and the agent. What does that mean? What does that mean? Well, what this means is that if you're an agent and you know something about the property, but the seller does not, well, guess what? You still have to disclose that. So it doesn't matter how you came across the information. If you know something the seller doesn't, you have to disclose it. Well, most of the time it doesn't really matter because the seller is the one who knows everything about the property, or at least they know a lot about the property, and they're the ones who are making the disclosures. And once they make a disclosure, well, you're not required to repeat the same disclosure. You're not required to provide duplicative disclosures. But occasionally, an agent will know a lot about a property, more than the seller, and that does present a problem. But just keep in mind, in that circumstance, the agent will be making the disclosures. Now, you should be running those disclosures by the seller, hopefully getting their at least tacit consent that I'm making these disclosures, and then there's no issue. It only really comes up as an issue when the seller is saying, don't you dare disclose that, and that's a whole other can of worms. But basically, if you know something the seller doesn't, you need to disclose it nonetheless. And the duty to disclose material facts is for all properties. It's not limited to residential 1 to 4s. It's for everything: commercial, vacant land, residential 5+, everything. And that's why I say, you know, even if you're selling a commercial property, you still probably want to use, at the very least, the ESD. The ESD, I would say, is the minimum disclosure that a seller of a commercial property would be making in terms of material facts, because even a commercial property, you still have a duty to disclose material facts, and the ESD is asking the seller directly, are you aware of any material facts? So even though it's not technically required by the contract, for me, I think you want to use the ESD at a bare minimum as a material fact disclosure for commercial property. When in doubt, disclose. That's your basic rule. You've probably heard it tons and tons and tons of time. So if you don't know whether something needs to be disclosed, then you probably need to disclose it. And always use the per rule. So if you are forced as an agent to make a disclosure, you're never going to make the disclosure on your own if you can help it. You're always going to cite the source, per the neighbor, per this guy, per the assessor. So always cite the source, and you're going to disclaim. So the basic rule is attribute and disclaim. And this is especially important with square footage. So you're putting together a flyer. You're going to cite the source of where you get the square footage, and you're going to disclaim the source. We have not verified this information. Broker has not verified this information. Buyer to conduct their own investigations. So very important to not only cite the source, but to state that the buyer, that the broker has not verified the information. Now, fourth bullet point, report only facts. Don't speculate. So I have a story here. It's the Fong case. So the Fong case is not a groundbreaking case. It's not like a big case in real estate, but it's a very good teaching case. And so I like to tell the story of the Fong case. So the Fong case involved what we call it the sea air case. The sea air case, and it involves a property located, I guess, next to the ocean, and the buyer is on the property with his agent, it's a dual agent, and the buyer asks, "Hey, what is that musky smell? Like, what stinks around here? What is that musky smell?" And the agent told the buyer that it was the sea air. It's just the sea air. And it could be fixed by, quote, changing things like sheetrock. Okay, so it's just the sea air and changing things like the sheetrock. Well, of course, the buyer bought the property, and it turns out it wasn't the sea air. What was the problem? Well, after sale, the buyer found a buried septic tank and a buried oil tank. So compounding the problem, there was an inadvertent spill when removing the tank, and the buyer basically had to, it was a total loss. The buyer had to tear down the property. So the buyer sued the agent, the dual agent brokerage, and they settled for $275,000. So what are the lessons there? Well, there's two mistakes, and they're pretty clear. One, if you don't know the answer to something, don't speculate as to what the answer is. Don't make things up, right? You're not selling cars here. These are big sales, huge purchases, a lot of money at stake. So you have to be truthful. If you don't know, you don't know. And also, as stated before, you're not providing advice on how to remediate problems on the property. You're not telling the buyer how to fix things. So that's another mistake they made. The agent told the buyer you could just fix it by changing the sheetrock. Well, you couldn't. Had nothing to do with the sheetrock. Okay. So I'm going to talk about another case here. The last bullet point: be clear, complete, and candid. So on this one, it involves a well. This is a case I actually worked on. I helped write the amicus brief for it, and it involved a single statement at issue. Water level fluctuates. So picture this: you got a house on a lake, and there's a dock, and at the end of the dock, there's a boat. Okay, and the buyer's buying this property, and the seller sends over a disclosure, and on the disclosure it says water level fluctuates. The buyer reads that, he signs it, acknowledging receipt. Okay, well, what does that mean? Water level fluctuates. So curious. What is it? Okay. Well, after close, what the buyer discovered was the water level fluctuating means that it recedes so much that the lake basically turns into a kind of mud flat, and the boat sits on mud. Okay, so the buyer felt that was a misrepresentation. The buyer sued, and it went to a jury. Okay, well, the interesting thing about this is, even when it's going to a jury, you still don't know whether it's legally sufficient, whether the disclosure is legally sufficient. And as it turns out, it wasn't, because the jury returned a verdict in favor of the buyer. They felt, yes, that was a misrepresentation. So I spoke with the attorney who worked on this case, who handled it directly, and he said we would have never let it go to trial had the buyer not acknowledged this disclosure in writing. Well, the thing is, see, this guy was a great attorney. He was really good, but even he did not know whether it was legally sufficient. And in fact, No attorney can tell you this. We get questions like this on the hotline all the time. An agent is asking us, what is the bare minimum that we can say to describe this problem while being legally compliant? What's the smallest thing we can say and still be legally compliant? You know what? No attorney can answer that question for you. It's not answerable. And that's why that's the wrong approach. So the right approach is not to hide the ball. Be clear, be candid. So what could the seller have said to have avoided the problem? Well, they could have said water level fluctuates at certain points during the year. The boat, is not usable because the water level recedes so much. Be more descriptive. Explain to the buyer what the problem is. And that's really the advice. Be clear, be complete, be candid. Okay, so that's the story. Now, we've spent a lot, and let's see if we have any questions here. Okay, so one question we got, please elaborate on the comment made the SBSA does not replace in-house disclosures. Okay, so in-house disclosures usually it's something that your brokerage, like a lot of brokerages, especially if they're large, they know about problems that have arisen locally. Maybe the groundwater level has dropped so much that that there's problems with groundwater. Maybe it's sort of a gang-infested area, and these are sort of general disclosures which are not specific to any particular property, but are something which maybe the buyer should be aware of. And so a lot of brokerages develop these in-house disclosures which sort of enumerate all of the local area problems that a buyer might want to know about. So that's what I call in-house disclosures. And the SBSA, though, is not specific to any one area of California. It's general across the state, issues that could arise anywhere. So it's like I said, it doesn't replace it. It's used in tandem with an in-house disclosure. On the TDS, I put dog scratches on doors. Is that the best way to state pup damage? That's good. I mean, I think that gets the idea across. I don't see a problem with that. Okay. Now, so far we've been talking about essentially the duties of the listing agent and the seller to provide disclosures to the buyer. But a very important part of this process is what happens when the disclosures are received. What does the buyer's agent do with these disclosures? And we were given a clue to what happens with these two cases, which I'm going to talk about now. And these two cases basically explain the risk involved when it comes to handling of disclosures received from the listing side. So, and you'll notice that the two cases are actually quite similar in their basic facts. So let's start with the Salahutin case from 1994. And in the Salahutin case, you had a property that was on the MLS that was described as, oh, I'm sorry, just one second here. You have a property on the MLS, and on the MLS it was described as 1+ acre. 1+ acre. And the buyer's agent presented that information to the buyer, and they passed it off to the buyer. And after close, the property was found not to be 1+ acre. It was 0.998 acres, and because it was not 1 acre at the time, the property could not be split, thus frustrating the purposes for which the buyer bought the property. The buyer sued. It was a agent broker representing the buyer exclusively. And I'm just going to read from the case. So I'll just read from the case. Quote, while he is the agent, the buyer's agent, while he was not required to investigate the seller's representations or the truth of the description contained in the multiple listing service sheet before showing the property to plaintiffs, Siegel, that's the name of the buyer's agent, Siegel was at least required to tell plaintiffs that he had not verified the information he was passing on to them, that he was simply relying upon the description provided by the sellers. So there you have it. Going back to our previous slide, attribute and disclaim. Here is the information we got from the MLS. We don't know if it's true. We haven't verified it. You know, be skeptical. So that's the first case, Silent Hoot case. Fast forward 20 years, 2014, got the Safi case. Safi case is a very similar kind of case, similar facts. So this case involved a listing broker who wrote onto the MLS, quote, this parcel is in an earthquake study zone, but has had a fault hazard investigation completed and has been declared buildable by the investigating licensed geologist. Report available for serious buyers. That sounds pretty good. So you got a report by a licensed geologist, declared buildable. One problem. The report was from 1982. Now that date did appear on the cover. Right on the cover it was there. But in the intervening years, the county building standards had changed. That was after the Northridge earthquake in 1994. And at the time of the offer and acceptance, this property was no longer buildable. Okay. When the buyer's agent received the report, he gave it to the buyer and told the buyer to check it out. Check it out. And the judge wasn't really satisfied with that. And the judge found that the buyer's broker had led the buyer to believe that the report was current and could be relied upon as an indication that the property was in fact ready to build. So similar lesson there. Attribute and disclaim. Hey, we got this report. It's from the listing side, obviously. We have not verified the report. We don't know if this is true. But what else should the buyer's agent have done? The buyer's agent probably should have sat the buyer down, discussed it, and recommended further investigations. And also, because it had the date right on the cover, obviously you want to point that out. Now, you don't have to read through the report to figure out everything about it. Again, that's not the expertise of an agent. But if there's a date on the cover, you should see that and point it out. But you're always going to take the time, sit the buyer down, discuss what you can, and recommend further investigations. Also, I don't like the check it out, which was the testimony of the buyer's agent. That's too casual. This is very serious, very serious. This is the most important investment that anybody will make in their lifetime. A lot of money. So you can't be casual in these matters. Okay, so what about the listing agent in this side? So the buyer's agent, this is not a dual agency, the buyer's agent and broker were found liable. What about the listing agent? The listing agent was also sued, but the judge decided that the listing brokerage had no liability because everything they said was true. There was a report. The property was declared buildable. It was by an investigating licensed geologist. True, true, and true. So, not liable. But, let's be honest, the listing broker got lucky here. If your representation is strictly true but could be easily misinterpreted, you're walking a very fine line. So another judge or jury could have decided that this was in fact a misleading, this was a misrepresentation. Keep in mind that the goal is never to simply prevail at trial. The goal is to keep from being sued in the first place. So the advice is to be candid and perhaps think of the NAR Code of Ethics, which requires agents to provide a true picture, be clear that the report is 25 years old, and of course state that the broker has not verified the accuracy of the report, and that's the lesson. Okay? Now, we have, where are we on this thing? Okay, we're going to take another 5-minute break because I think it's kind of a little tough just sitting here and listening to all this stuff. But anyway, a 5-minute break, and we're going to start up at 12:10. And 12:10, I'm going to start up, and we'll just finish out the class. I can go through these slides pretty quickly if I have to. All right, 5-minute break. Okay, so here we are, 12:10, and so I have this more material fact issue slide. So basically we get questions about delivery of reports, and we used to give a kind of complicated answer, but since the SPQ has been added to the contract, it's an extremely clear answer. The SPQ requires the seller to deliver all reports in their possession. So that's the answer. But there's more. You should be aware that the SPQ not only requires all reports to be delivered, but it says reports, inspections, disclosures, warranties, maintenance recommendations, estimates, studies, surveys, other documents. So this is it's kind of a laundry list of all the things that the seller is required to deliver to the buyer if they have that in their possession. Basically anything which affects the condition of the property, if it's on a piece of paper, you need to copy it and give it over to the seller. And that is on the SPQ. It's on section M. So if you're to look at section M of the SPQ, you'd see that one there. Now repairs, same thing. The SPQ asks the seller, seller, are you aware of any material repairs? And it doesn't give a timeline for this. It doesn't say within the last 5 years, the last 10 years. No, it just says repairs. And so if they are aware of any repairs, they need to disclose them. We've sort of touched on this a bit, but I'll just go over it. The contract requires that these disclosures be delivered within 7 days after acceptance, and it's pretty important, and that's for everything really. It's pretty important that the listing side stay on track, because if you don't have everything done within the time frame, then that gives the buyer all sorts of excuses. Maybe they get more time to remove contingencies. Maybe they get more time to close. You don't know. So you want to stay on track, or in order to keep everything on schedule. Death of an occupant. Now, everything we've been talking about so far has been about disclosing things, disclosing material facts, and all sorts of other stuff. And what happens if you don't disclose? You're in trouble, you can be liable, all this bad stuff. But the death of an occupant law is different. This is not a law which requires you to disclose something, quite the opposite. No, it's a law which immunizes you from not disclosing something. So what it says is that if you don't disclose, you're immunized, the seller and the agent are immunized from liability for failing to disclose the death of an occupant or the manner of death, where that death occurred 3 years before the buyer was presented an offer to purchase. And why is it that the seller or agent does not have to disclose this if the death occurred more than 3 years ago? The law tells us why. The reason is because it's not a material fact. It says that right in the law. It's not a material fact. So you don't have liability for failing to disclose the death of an occupant more than 3 years out. Now, this law does not permit you to lie. Okay? You don't have an affirmative obligation to simply come out and disclose it, but you don't have the right to lie. So if somebody asks you, hey Joe, did somebody die in this property 5 years ago? If you know the answer is yes, you can't lie and say no. Now you have liability. You can refuse to answer the question. You can say I neither confirm nor deny that question or that answer or whatever, but you can't lie. Okay. What about the second bullet point? What about if somebody was afflicted with HIV or AIDS? Well, the reason why this is in here is because when the law was originally written, it actually was only about HIV and AIDS. That was the whole point of the law originally. It said that this did not have to be disclosed no matter how recently. Now, if somebody has in fact died from that condition, the seller would still disclose the death if it occurred within the last 3 years, but you would not have to disclose why. And in fact, if you are asked, you shouldn't disclose it, because asking about whether somebody died because of AIDS or HIV, or whether they had that at all, is illegal. It's a type of fair housing violation. So if a listing agent is asked, hey, did somebody have AIDS or HIV while living on this property, or did they die of that? You should not engage that person. You should not engage in what is a discriminatory practice. I can't engage in a discriminatory practice. Okay, so that's the death of an occupant. Oh, by the way, our form SPQ or ESD asks directly, seller, are you aware of a death on the property that occurred within the last 3 years? So by using our forms, the seller will disclose the death if it occurred within the last 3 years. Now, some agents, they want to disclose a death that occurred 5 or 10 years out. They just want to get that, you know, they want to get that out there so that they don't get a problem later on. Not that there would be legal liability, but they just don't want it. And if that's your approach, that's okay, you can do that. But you really should discuss it with your broker and the seller. So explain to the seller what the law says, and you know, maybe that's as a strategic approach. You can take that approach. It's not wrong. It's just not legally required. It might be an advantage in some areas, depending upon, you know, other things. Okay, so what if there is a violent death? Is that a material fact then? Well, the law is very clear on this one. It says you don't have to disclose the death or the manner of death. It says that right in the law, or the manner of death. And in fact, this whole law was based somewhat on the Reed case. I think the King versus Reed, which involved a violent death. So the law was written in essence to overturn the result of the case. So it doesn't matter how violent the death was. If it occurred, you don't have to disclose the manner of the death or the manner of the death if it occurred more than 3 years out. Okay. Okay, we're moving from death to registered sex offenders. This is the most exciting part of the class. So you don't have to have a specific, there's not a specific disclosure which has to be added here, because the Megan's Law database disclosure is already pre-printed in all of our residential contracts. So there's not a separate piece of paper that has to be provided. You're providing the disclosure in the contract itself. And the main point I try to get across here is that, as a general rule, agents should not be viewing the database. Okay? There's no legal requirement to view the database. And the reason why you shouldn't view the database is because if you view the database and you find out that the guy next door is a registered sex offender, guess what? You have actual knowledge. Now you have actual knowledge, you have to disclose actual knowledge. So that's why you don't view the database. I mean, the seller might not be aware of all of these people, and you going and finding out is not going to make the seller very, very happy. Now there's going to be affirmative obligation to disclose actual knowledge. There's going to be some circumstances where you might want to view the database, but if that's the circumstance, if you're in that situation, then you'll talk it over with your broker and the client. Get the seller. So the seller consents, they know the risk. okay, then you can view it. Okay, we got the booklets. There's 5 of them. Now the first 2, the Residential Environmental Hazards booklet and the Home Energy Rating System booklet, the HERS booklet. Those booklets are always optional, always. So you never have to deliver them by law. However, there's a reason why you should deliver them anyway. And that's because delivery of these booklets provides the seller and the agent with just a bit of liability protection. What the law says is that if you deliver these booklets, you're not required to provide any further general information concerning the subject matter of the booklet. So it just gives you a little bit of an edge. So we say deliver them. Now, the Homeowner's Guide to Earthquake Safety and Residential Hazards report, that will be required on a pre-1960 residential 1-4 property. Okay, so if you have a pre-1960 residential 1-4 property, it's required. Otherwise, it's optional. And again, you can still deliver it even though it's optional. Now, the lead-based paint pamphlet is also going to be required on most pre-1978 properties. So the lead-based paint pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home, required on most pre-78 residential properties. And if required, yeah, so even if not required, again, same thing, even if it's an optional disclosure, should still be delivered. Now, how do you deliver these disclosures? You can deliver them using the combined hazard booklet in hard copy, or we have them available on zip form through the EPUBs function. So you can deliver them electronically through EPUBs. You go onto zip form, you have to change the library. There's a drop-down menu. It says select library. You click on it, pulls it down, EPUBs, and you can deliver it that way. Now, here's the residential earthquake hazards report. If the property is a pre-1960 residential 1-4 and not TDS exempt, then it's mandatory that you deliver the Homeowner's Guide to Earthquake Safety booklet. And if you have to deliver the booklet, the questionnaire at the back of the booklet is required to be filled out. So you may have not noticed this questionnaire before, but it's there. So on your pre-1960 residential 1-4 without TDS exemption, the seller is going to be filling out this booklet as well. I'm sorry, the seller is going to be filling out this questionnaire as well. And similarly, you have the lead-based paint pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home, in circumstances where it's required on pre-78 residential property. It's going to be required most of the time. In that circumstance, the seller is also going to fill out Form FLD. Okay, so when the lead booklet is required, the seller will fill out Form FLD as well. Okay, so let's see if we have any questions here. Okay, so just to be clear, even if you provide the earthquake report with the NHD, you do not need to do the checklist on the back. Yeah, so those are 2 completely separate disclosures, the NHD disclosure regarding the earthquake hazard zones and the booklet. So you would do the questions on the back if it's a pre-1960 property, residential 1-4 without TDS exemption. So if that's the kind of property it is, then the seller will fill out the questionnaire on the back. It doesn't really have anything to do with the NHD. Okay. And yeah, so basically the point is that when the booklet is required, the questionnaire needs to be filled out. That's the way to think about it. Booklet required, questionnaire needs to be filled out. And the same for the lead. When the lead booklet is required, the FLD should be filled out as well. Okay, thank you for that. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the federal tax withholding because I know it's everyone's favorite topic, but you can't really do this disclosure class without talking about these FIRPTA forms. So here we go. Okay. So basically, you have a law which requires the buyer to withhold 15% of the gross sales price if the seller is a foreign person. Okay. And if the buyer doesn't withhold, then the buyer may be liable for tax penalties, if the seller later on fails to pay their taxes on the transaction. So the way I think about this law, and hopefully it will help you understand it as well, is what this law is doing, it's putting the burden on the buyer to become a kind of tax collector. See, the buyer is working for the IRS, basically. It is the buyer who is required to withhold part of the purchase price from the seller's proceeds to make sure the seller pays their taxes, which would be due on the sale. Now, if the buyer doesn't withhold and the seller doesn't pay their taxes, then the buyer could be penalized. So that's how that law works. Now, in addition to that basic framework, there are a number of exemptions. And the name of the game when you're talking about this FIRPTA law is to get an exemption in order to avoid the withholding. That's the whole point. Okay? So that's what we're going to be talking about. You have this law which says buyer withhold if you're selling to a foreign person. If you don't, you can be liable for penalties. But guess what? There's these exemptions where you don't have to withhold. And so that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about how do you fall into the exemption so that you don't have to do the withholding at all. And I'm going to go through them. So the first one is the buyer's affidavit, and this is the very easy exemption. And all that has to happen here is if the buyer is buying a property which they will be taking occupancy, and the property is $300,000 or less in purchase price, then all the buyer has to do is they fill out Form AB and they keep it in their file. Done. That's it. So that's the simple, easy option that gives the buyer the exemption. Okay. And if you have that type of property, you'll do that every time. Now, this, of course, works great for places like Kansas or Minnesota, where probably most properties don't sell for $300,000. But here in California, it's obviously not going to work for a lot of properties. What do you do then? Well, you can use the seller's affidavit. So FIRPTA, if we take a step back here, FIRPTA stands for Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act, and it's aimed at withholding when the seller is a foreigner. Okay, so the way this affidavit works is the seller will sign the affidavit stating the buyer, stating that they are not a foreign person. So if the seller signs the affidavit stating they are not the foreign person, then the buyer is not required to withhold. They get the exemption. And incidentally, obviously, there's to achieve the status of non-foreign status. Obviously, you could be a U.S. citizen. You can also be a green card holder, or you can meet what's called the substantial presence test, where you've lived in the U.S. for a certain number of days over the last 3 years. So in all of those circumstances, the seller can simply sign the affidavit and then get the exemption. Now, the problem with this method is, in order to get the exemption, you have to do these 3 things. You have to fill out the form, you have to declare that you're not a non-resident alien, and you have to provide the tax ID number on the form, and you have to give that to the buyer. So you have to do those 3 things, and the problem for most sellers is they don't want to give the buyer a form with their social security number. So this was such an extraordinary issue for a long time that California and NAR, because it's a federal law, we lobbied the federal government to change the law. And because of these objections, we got what's called the FERP to Fix law passed in 2008. So the way the FERP to Fix law works is, instead of giving the, well, I have it written out here. So this is how it works. So instead of giving the affidavit with the seller's social security number to the buyer, the seller can instead give the completed affidavit to the escrow or title company. So the seller still fills out the affidavit, but they don't give it to the buyer. Instead, they give it to the escrow. At that point, the escrow fills out the qualified substitute form. The escrow then gives a copy of their qualified substitute declaration to the buyer. The escrow holds on to the FERPTA form for 5 years, and basically that's it. So the net result is the buyer does not receive the seller's tax ID number. The law has been complied with, and there's no requirement to do the withholding. Okay, so that was the FERP to Fix law that was worked out. It's kind of complicated, but the basic point is the escrow will hold the seller's affidavit with the Social Security information. They'll write their own declaration. They'll hand that to the buyer. Okay, and the upshot is the buyer does not have to do the withholding because they get the exemption. Okay, so this works pretty well, and all that's really dependent upon is for the escrow to agree to hold on to the QS for 5 years, and most escrows do it. Now, let's see, we have a question here. So can they give the form to the escrow agent instead? And so, yeah, the question is answered. Okay, you got it. Okay. Occasionally, you'll run across an escrow that refuses to act as the qualified substitute. And if that happens, then you have a bit of a problem, because obviously now the seller really needs to deliver the affidavit directly to the buyer with a Social Security number. So what you can do in that circumstance is you can point out to the escrow, hey, escrow, the RPA requires you to act as a qualified substitute. It says that right in the instructions, and you accepted the RPA. So you can try to pressure them into acting as a qualified substitute based upon the language of our contract. But ultimately that might not work, because you can't really force them to do something they really don't want to do. And I would say the advice then is, well, choose a different escrow from the start. Make sure the escrow is willing to do this for you to begin with, otherwise don't use them. But let's say you're in an escrow already, you're not going to switch escrows, and the escrow is refusing to act as a qualified substitute. Well, in that case, the seller simply has to provide the buyer directly with the affidavit form with the Social Security number. Okay, what happens if you have a circumstance where the escrow is refusing to act as a qualified substitute and the seller is also refusing to provide the buyer with the filled out FIRPTA form? Okay, so what do you do then? How does the buyer do the withholding at that point? Well, at that point, the buyer is in fact required to withhold. So the correct approach at that point is for the buyer to instruct the escrow to withhold. That's what has to happen. Buyer instructs escrow to withhold. I mean, hopefully that you'll avoid that problem. It won't come up, but that's how it's worked out. Now, we did revise our FIRPTA form this year, and there's a number of changes, but as far as the biggest change, I would say, has to do with you know, I don't even have it listed here on the biggest change. This section here, which the seller fills out to include your Social Security number, that actually has to be filled out by hand. Zip form doesn't allow that information to be entered through the zip form, and we've done that as a cybersecurity precaution. It's not really. It's very cautious. We don't want agents or brokers to be in possession of that sensitive tax ID information. So we avoid the whole problem by having the seller fill this out by hand, and frankly, they would then have to deliver it directly to the escrow. Okay. Now, in the meantime, the seller can provide a copy of this form without this information. This information is just left blank to the buyer, and what that does is it tells the buyer that the seller will be using a qualified substitute, as it says here in number 3. So this new form presumes a qualified substitute. It tells the buyer we will be using a qualified substitute, so you can just provide this form. The listing site can provide it to the buyer with this information here blank, right? And then the seller takes the form in hard copy, fills out this information, and provides it directly to the escrow. So that's how that's supposed to work. It's a bit complicated, huh? Okay. Now, California withholding, we generally don't spend a lot of time talking about because in almost all circumstances, the escrow themselves does the withholding. And they fill out all the forms. There's 593 forms. Essentially, California law, in a sense, puts the burden on the escrow to do this. And you don't have a problem with the Social Security number because the Franchise Tax Board allows the escrow to black out the Social Security information on the seller's copy. So as a practical matter, it just simply, California withholding doesn't really come up as an issue. Okay. Let's see if we have any other questions on the tax withholding. And it's a tricky topic, but it's pretty important, I think. Okay. Now, we actually have a new law pertaining to these HOA disclosures this year. And the new law, what itself, you know what? Let me skip to the next slide first. Huh? No, this one is not. Well, first I'll go through it. So first, we have these 3 forms: HOA 1, 2, and 3. And one thing I want you to see as part of this slide is that the seller will have 3 days after acceptance to request these disclosures from the HOA. Now I know the seller often doesn't do this, it's oftentimes the title company, but whoever it is, there's 3 days after acceptance, and you can use these 3 forms to make the request. You will use all 3 forms together. And a couple years ago, the law was changed to require the seller to pay for the HOA docs. If you notice on our purchase agreement under paragraph 7, it talks about all the costs and expenses. It doesn't give the option of the seller not paying for the mandatory HOA disclosures. And you're thinking, well, why is that? And the reason is because the law says the seller will pay for it. So the practical effect of this is that the seller has to bring money in during the escrow, and that's unusual because normally a seller doesn't bring money in to pay for anything during the escrow. But because of this law, that's what the seller has to do. And so the way it will typically work is the escrow will make the request to the HOA, or it could be the agent, and then the escrow will tell the seller, bring in the money, and the seller has 3 days to bring in the money to pay for these docs. Now, as I said, there is a new law pertaining to this, and I want to see if it's, I don't have the slide. Okay, so there's a new law pertaining to this, and what the new law says, it sort of doubles down on the seller protections to start with. So what are the seller protections? The seller protections are, they're designed to allow the seller to review an estimate of the cost of all these CI disclosures, line by line, item by item. And the seller can review them, and if the seller has any of these disclosures in their possession, like the CC&Rs, the minutes, other restrictions, you know, each item, there's like 10 different items. If the seller has any of these items in their possession, then they're permitted to say to the HOA, look, HOA, I don't want to buy these particular docs. I already have them. I will give them to the buyer free of charge. So the seller is permitted to do that. They send the estimate back to the HOA. The HOA is then supposed to redo it, subtracting out all of the disclosures that the seller says I have in my possession. That's the way the law is supposed to work. And what the new law does is it essentially tells the seller exactly that on Form HOA2. So if we go back to this form, there's this slide. There's three forms: HOA 1, 2, and 3. On HOA2, there's going to be new language explaining what the seller's rights are. Okay. I frankly don't know if this is going to make any difference because nobody seems to be following these laws at all, but now perhaps because it's going to be directly written on the form explaining what the seller's rights are, maybe somebody will. I mean, the idea, of course, is that a lot of these these HOAs are jacking up the prices of these disclosures and charging well beyond what their actual costs of production of the documents are, and they're not allowed to do that. So we've tried legislatively to rein them in for several years now, but without much success, and who knows if this new approach will work. But the approach is to explain the rights of the sellers directly on the Form HOA2, and that law actually goes into effect starting next year, January 1st. Okay. Let's see what else we have here. Okay, if a seller who owns several condos in the same HOA and is selling them separately, which HOA docs can they reuse? You know, let's see. If you want to see, that's a good question, but you know what? I will tell you something here. In order to see exactly what docs are required, you can go to the form HOA2, and HOA2 actually provides you with a complete list of all of the legally required disclosures, And I'm doing that right now. I have the book right in front of me. I'm pulling it up, and let's look at the list. So articles of incorporation, well, that one can be reused. CC&Rs, I think that one can be reused. The bylaws, yes. Rules and regulations, yes. Age restrictions. And basically everyone down the line can be reused unless they've been updated or changed, you know, rendering the seller's disclosures non-current. So that's the whole thing. If any of these disclosures have been changed between the time the seller has them and the day of acceptance, or actually the day of providing them to the buyer, then of course they can't reuse them. But this, what you're saying here in your question, is a perfect example of how this law would actually benefit tremendously a seller who is reselling, who is selling several different units within the same HOA. Okay, so on to this slide, the representative capacity. Now, our contract was changed last year, and it includes a provision for representative capacity, meaning if either the buyer or the seller is acting in a representative capacity, then they have 3 days. They have to do two things. They should be signing the RCSD, the Representative Capacity Signature Disclosure, but they will also be providing within 3 days proof or evidence of their authority. And for example, if it's a probate or a trust or a power of attorney, those are, or an LLC or a corporation, those are all entities in which somebody will be acting in a representative capacity. So let's say you have a probate, and the buyer or the seller, let's say the seller signs the RCSD indicating that they're acting as the administrator or executor on behalf of the probated estate. So in that case, the seller within 3 days will provide what are called letters testamentary. And letters testamentary are the proof of the authority that the seller has. So likewise, for trusts, you'll provide the applicable portion of the trust or trust certification, either one. Power of attorney, you'll provide a copy of the power of attorney. Corporate, if you're acting on behalf of a corporation, you'll provide a corporate resolution. And if it's an LLC, you'll provide formation documents. Now, this is difficult to remember these things, but you don't have to remember them because they're stated in the body of the contract right here. It says, we'll provide evidence of authority such as, but not limited to, applicable portion of the trust, letters testamentary, court order, power of attorney, corporate resolution, or formation document. So it tells you in the contract what it is that they should be providing. Okay. And so we just have basically 2 more sections here. One is on local ordinance, and the other is a sort of wrap-up of disclosures. And so let me talk about these local ordinance disclosures, because this is actually pretty important. I know we're in the home stretch, but if you bear with me, this is a very big disclosure, can be a very big disclosure. Okay. Now, if you remember before, I spoke about smoke alarms, water heater bracing, CO detectors, and I said that these were point of sale requirements. Well, yes, they are. They're state point of sale requirements. Under state law, these things are required to be done and certified for smoke alarms and smoke and water heater bracing, before close. Now, that's the state law. What about the local law? What about a city, county, community services district? is it possible for a city or county or community service district to adopt similar laws which are applicable only at the local level? And the answer is absolutely. They definitely can do it. In fact, cities and counties have all sorts of rules depending on the place. They can have point of sale retro work or retrofit work as a condition of closing. They can require that it be certified. They also have requirements to generate certain reports. That can be a local requirement. And in extreme cases, they can even require inspections from a government inspector or an approved inspector. Now, you might not have come across these things. And the reason why you might not have ever seen them is because most cities, in fact, do not have any such requirements. But I can think of at least 3 cities off the top of my head which are pretty well known, which have them. And I'm thinking of San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego. So you will come across them, depending upon where you work. How would you find out if your city or locality has such requirements? Well, as an agent, the way you find out, let's say you're working in a new area, you're entering into a new uncharted area, you're not sure what's going on there. Normally what you're going to do is you're going to talk to people. I think calling up a local escrow or title company that's long-standing and reputable in the area, they would almost certainly be able to help you out there. Other agents can be quite knowledgeable. I did a class in Beverly Hills not so long ago, in an in-person class, and there was a guy in there who knew like everything about all of these cities in Southern California. It was really amazing. So some agents will be able to tell you. You can also call up the city or look at the website from the city. So there's a lot of ways to sort of do some legwork and find these things out. On the legal hotline, we don't tell you because we don't advise on local ordinances in that way. So you won't be able to call up the legal hotline to find out. Okay. Now, I have here general advice. General advice on how to deal with local ordinances. And I know that it will depend on the city, and this is not going to be adopted across the board because depending upon where you are, well, anyway, you'll get it. So basically, my first piece of advice is if there's a report required, like there is in LA, I would try to have the report issued before putting property on the market. And the reason is obvious, because if you have a zoning report or other types of report or building report required, you'll eliminate surprises. There's either code violations or potential repairs. You'll eliminate surprises. You'll avoid potential misrepresentation for having misstated, the condition of the property on the MLS. It just makes the whole transaction go much smoother. So that's the first piece of advice. Second piece of advice is do not attempt to waive the requirements. The buyers and sellers sometimes, when they find out about these requirements, their first instinct is to say, oh, well, the buyer will handle it. And if the city allows for that, and they make it very clear, like for example in San Diego, you have special water conserving plumbing fixtures down there. That's a local ordinance which is required. It's actually fairly easy to put the burden on the buyer after close. But ordinarily, you're not going to want to do that for 2 reasons. First off, these laws will impose a direct or indirect requirement on the agent. I've read through a lot of them, and it's surprising how often they put the burden on the agent. So if the buyer and seller are waiving these laws, they're actually creating liability for the agent. And the second reason is because oftentimes these laws are not waivable. Some laws can be waived, some laws can't. These laws often cannot be. So not a good idea. Okay. And the other piece of advice has to do with the contract itself. So I'm looking at, this is page 3 of the contract. This should be 7b, which allocates costs. And you might have seen this before. And the first 7b1 is pretty obvious. It says seller shall pay for smoke alarm and carbon monoxide device installation, water heater bracing if required. And you can check the box for the cost there, right? This 7b2, though, people get confused on. Buyer or seller shall pay the cost of compliance with any other minimum mandatory government inspections and reports if required as a condition of closing. So what's that? Well, that is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about local area conditions. So that's what this is. Now, my advice is generally, if you're a buyer and you're making an offer, check one of the boxes. Check seller, or check both of them. That indicates at the very least you're splitting the cost. And the reason why you want to do that rather than leaving it blank is because if you have one of the boxes checked at least, then you know who is going to pay for it if in fact it's required. The issue has been resolved. If you leave it completely blank and it turns out that there is no local retrofit requirements, it makes no difference checking the box. So like if I check the box saying buyer will pay for this and it turns out there's nothing there in terms of local requirements, then there's nothing for the buyer to pay for. It's not an issue. So the idea is check the box and that way you'll resolve the ambiguity. Okay, anyway, I'm going to wrap things up here. Just very briefly, we have on our website these various disclosure charts. They give you a sort of complete breakdown of the legal requirements the legal disclosure requirements in any sale. The sales disclosure chart is the most popular and most downloaded item from our site. Here's a copy of the first page. It sort of gives you a complete breakdown of all the legal requirements for residential 1 to 4s, probates, foreclosures, bankruptcies, residential 5+, vacant land, commercial, mobile homes. So everything, it's a good chart. And I've also made, for your edification, this extra list. It's 3 pages in length, which gives you a standard breakdown of every legally required disclosure. So we're not talking the optional or risk management disclosures here, but the legally required disclosures for a standard residential 1 to 4, not a TDS exempt sale. Okay, so let's see if we have any other questions here. And let's see here. The RCSD, on the RCSD and providing evidence. The seller, if whoever is signing in a representative capacity is supposed to provide evidence within 3 days after acceptance. So it's another 3-day timeline. That's why I put those 2 slides together, because they're both 3 days, different from the normal 7-day period. Okay, anyway, thanks a lot for, and let's see, somebody else has another question here. What is your website to find these additional disclosures? Okay, the website to find these additional disclosures is car.org. So if you go to car.org, you go there and you click on risk management, and under risk management you'll find all of these disclosure charts. All right, thank you for bearing with me. Thank you for coming to the class. I hope this is a helpful class. I hope it will assist you in your practice out there in the field. And anyway, everyone have a great day, have a great rest of the day, and have a good weekend, because we're almost there as well. All right, goodbye.